Hey, good evening. Welcome. Excited to be here with Eric Ries for our standard speaker series. For most of you, I think Eric needs no introduction. He's the author of The Lean Startup and The Startup Way, books that have become required reading for business leaders, entrepreneurs, basically anyone interested in the topics of innovation and innovation at scale. His first book, The Lean Startup, sold over 1 million copies, was translated into 30 languages, became the basis of what we've discussed a lot, lean startup methodology, the lean startup movement. And I think some measure of the influence he's had is the fact that the language we use today to describe startups, words like minimum viable product, which I think was the name of the first HBO episode of Silicon Valley.
Yes.
And pivot and fail fast and build, measure, learn are phrases that he really coined originally and popularized. He's quite a brilliant thinker. He's an entrepreneur himself, which we'll talk about. And he is also a very close friend, so we're excited to have you here. The one thing you may not know is that in his first book, The Lean Startup, I had a small but I think important cameo. Because Eric and I started a company together that was slightly less successful than our company is, but we started a company together in college. What was that? What did that company do? What was that company?
Well, see if this sounds like a good idea to you. We had this idea that college students from Ivy League universities should create online profiles for the purpose of sharing.
This was 5 years before Facebook, by the way.
Yeah, and that did turn out to be a pretty good idea later, but unfortunately, our idea was called catalyst recruiting, a phrase I've not uttered out loud in some time. It was the idea was they should create those profiles and share them with employers for the purpose of getting a job, which turns out not to be a very good idea. And certainly in 1999 was far too early for such a thing to be effective. And we were trapped by the idea that we were trying to create a real business. So if we had the wherewithal to think about pivoting to build Facebook, we would have been like, no, that's not real business. So, yeah, we were totally doomed.
So we did fail. We failed fast, but a lot of good has come out of it. And it's interesting. I mean, going back to the Lean Startup, which I think people are very familiar with, but I'm curious in retrospect, what you think or how you articulate what the core idea you were reacting to in the Lean Startup was. Was it this idea that innovation was a dark art and maybe it should be given rigor? Was it this idea that maybe people don't know what they're trying to build? What were you reacting to?
Yeah, so I remember, just since we're doing a trip down memory lane, I remember, so we had this company, it failed. It was a dot-com bubble, so everyone was making a company in their dorm room. And like my new rule of thumb is like by the time the bubble gets to New Haven, Connecticut, like that's the top. Now we were like the very last company started the dot-com bubble.
When philosophy majors are starting a company.
Yeah, this is a bad idea in every conceivable way,
but we didn't go to jail.
Had a completely predictable result in retrospect. But I remember, so afterwards, I was interviewing for jobs, and when I was in Silicon Valley, this is shocking to me. In most places, like I remember I was in a job interview in Boston, and I had to kind of like hide the fact that this company had failed. And I was trying to like euphemistically talk around it and whatever, and the guy kept asking me like, at the level of strategy, what were the mistakes that you made? And I'm trying to answer his question. I realized in the course of answering his question, I didn't understand the question. I didn't know what the word strategy actually meant. And so I couldn't answer his question because our company had no strategy, because we had never heard of strategy. We didn't know what that was, so of course we hadn't done it. And this was like a huge problem, and of course I did not get this job. But when I was in Silicon Valley, people were so excited by the fact that we had these incredible learning experiences on somebody else's dime that it was like a major plus. They're like, that's great because I won't have to waste my time teaching you all these mistakes. You've already made them. So you're like a leg up on other applicants. So that was very confusing. But then when I got into Silicon Valley, so the dominant ideas at that time even for entrepreneurship, were one, that a startup is just a miniaturized version of a big company. So it needs to have departments and executives, and we even in software development, we operated what was called the manufacturing metaphor of software development, where work proceeds as if on an assembly line from stage to stage, and you hand it across siloed departments. You can imagine how upset I was years later when I found out that they don't even use that in manufacturing anymore. So it's clear why we were using it as a metaphor. So like that was one really critical wrong idea. And then the other idea was that just like in conventional business, like strategy means having a plan and sticking to the plan, like through determination and effort and the power of your mind and whatever. If you write it down good enough, then this stuff will follow. And that's just not true. So it kept happening to me over and over again. Like we had a really beautiful business plan. I don't know if any archival copies still exist anywhere in the world, but
I
if
think
you
one
did
does.
have it,
I will tell you one does.
If you did have it, I mean, you would weep if you read it. It was so beautiful, so well written. Our analysis started with census data from first principle to deduce the average value of a customer to the. So like it was really extremely well constructed, by overeducated people too smart for their own good. The only problem with it was that the assumptions that it was based on were not correct. But other than that, it was really good. So it was obviously not led to a good business. When I went to Silicon Valley, it was the same idea. The business plans in the first startup I joined, I was like employee 30 at a company that had raised tens of millions of dollars in venture capital, really classic VC-based Silicon Valley company. The business plan was kept in the company library. Every copy of it was numbered. And you had to check it out and sign it back in, lest our incredibly secret plan be revealed to the world. So our 5 years of stealth R&D had to be a secret. God forbid anybody find out what we were doing, and that meant no customers allowed. Because if you showed the product to a customer, they might call someone and tell them what we were working on. So, some people are laughing because they understand that this is a recipe for disaster. But what people have a hard time understanding now is that was considered a best practice. We were considered like really elite, high executing folks because we were so focused on like perfecting this vision, getting it right, launching it into the world, and things would work. So when I just went through that company also failed. And I was like, my goal had been to apprentice myself to like the best entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. And I was like, in retrospect, they made the same dumb mistakes we made in our dorm room, but it's 2 orders of magnitude more expensive. But it's basically the same plan. And I was like, that can't possibly be right. And that's kind of what kicked off this journey for me of trying to figure out what could new and better ideas be. And at first I was not trying to like write a book and do this for a living. My original idea was just, in the next company I start, let's just make some new mistakes. Just for variety's sake, and not do the same, just do something different. And I had these intuitions around things being more iterative and more scientific and more customer-centric, and then that worked out okay. But what's interesting to me now when I look back on it, I had the job in that company of explaining to people why the crazy stuff that we did worked. Because business has actually changed a lot in a short time. Stuff that we were doing then was very countercultural, even in Silicon Valley. And people, my job, I was a young person running this company. I would hire people more experienced than me, veterans of the software industry, and they would work for me, and they would be like, listen, kid, this isn't how it's done. First you had to create a technical product requirements document. Anyone remember these? Create a product requirements document, then a technical requirements document, then you build an architecture plan, then the specification document, and like after you'd worked on that for who knows how long, then you could begin implementing. And of course, in Lean Startup, we would like deploy code to production 50 times a day. And so they were like, this isn't right. And I would be like, well, with all due respect, you're going to work for me. So why don't we try it my way first and see if you like it? And then if I'm crazy, like then we'll try it your way. And of course, like it was like a very green eggs and ham thing. Like once you try the new way, no one goes back. So like I kind of skate by on that for a while, and people get converted to this. But even the people that liked it were always asking me, but why does this work? It seems like it shouldn't work. Why does it work?
Is there some basic, idea that runs through? I mean, it's certainly true of startups. It was true of our startup, but certainly true of startups in general. But maybe runs through business at every level that kind of animates the thinking that businesses, as much as they think they know what their customers want, don't really know what their customers want?
Yeah, it's I mean, it's like, this is the human condition. This is like why science took a long time to be invented, and why, I don't want to get into like scientific paradigms and all that wonky stuff unless people are interested, in which case you're my crowd, that's great. But like, you know, to craft a falsifiable hypothesis about something that might happen in the future, I think in other domains, you know, like in chemistry, or in other domains, we've developed a reverence for the difficulty of that and the need for extremely careful thinking and rigor when you face that kind of uncertainty. And for whatever reason, business has not had that same intellectual development. So in a wide variety of business contexts, we are still in the age of astrology. I mean, seriously. Saying that you can predict the future from the signs. You don't walk, I mean, even here, I think, certainly in San Francisco, if you walk down the street and tell people that you know what's going to happen in the future, like, you could be committed for that. That's not necessarily a good thing, but like in business, that's considered like, you know, confidently projecting that you know the say-do ratio, all this. We have this like incredible apparatus around, you know, and it's like kind of like a great man theory of business. And certainly in entrepreneurship, Silicon Valley, like we have a fetish for this kind of thing, where like only the true entrepreneur, the true visionary could have seen the future. And one of my favorite hobbies is to go watch like video interviews of these great men, like at the early days, or like, you know, read the original press release, or like go back.
They had
like,
no idea what was going to happen.
No idea what they're talking about. There's a classic. You've never seen the video of Mark Zuckerberg on the couch at Stanford talking about Facebook. It's just like, it was some student project happened to catch him, like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what substances have been used in this house. I don't know what's going on. But like, he had very little understanding of what he was onto at that time, and there's all these a lot of famous stories about that. So this kind of like epistemological uncertainty about the future, I don't know why it's news in business, because in other parts of the world we've sorted this out. But I was once in a research lab, like the global research lab for a major multinational company. I've got, you know, all the managers and the senior scientists who run this research lab in a room, probably 200 of them, and I'm doing a lean startup workshop for them. And it was really not going very well, and they were very hostile to what I was saying. And I was like, so why are all of you practicing astrology in this lab? And they were like really upset at this accusation. You can imagine, these are like all professional scientists. And I was like, but you're telling me that you know already, in advance of doing any experimentation or research, what's going to happen with like the business aspects of these projects, because like the research is being defined by business use cases. But like, who decided the business use case? So I mean, I can tell you like all these hilarious stories of like they're designing this thing that is going to be used, you know, in an aircraft in Saudi Arabia in like the scorching desert heat. And like the use case has been defined by this, and it's like, have any of these people ever set foot in a desert before? And you know, they look at the research and they're like, there's a lot of sand there. Everyone understands there's also a sand component of the use case that we need to figure out. Of course, like they're like, oh yeah, that's a good point. And they're like, I'm bringing this up, but like it's just in corporate settings, we've developed this like crazy like, well, some business person told me this is the parameters of what it needs to be, and so we convince ourselves that that's somehow good. So I think that's kind of like a root idea. And it's not just what customers want, it's kind of anything that might happen in the future.
And you know, this became really the sort of the received wisdom for startups at least, right? Yeah. And I think they to their credit at least quickly adopted this framework of let's go out and test quickly. Yeah. Less so with more established companies and you know this. Do you think there's, I mean, as you describe it, there's not something fundamentally different between innovation at a startup level and innovation at scale? Obviously, we wrestle more here with this question of innovation at scale. What do you think are there fundamental roadblocks to that problem of innovation at scale that doesn't, or is it just that you have less to lose when you're a startup, so you're more willing to try new things? Yeah,
this is something that nobody believes. Like, I was kind of surprised when I found this out. I stumbled into this. I didn't expect to become like an innovation consultant to big companies. It wasn't like, I wasn't a kid who like grew up like, one day I'll be a consultant. That'll be exciting. So like, it was a very strange turn of events for me.
He was a recruiter.
Yeah, right. I was just trying to build software. Listen, I just wanted to build software that people use. I didn't care what it was. So when I first started working with big companies, it really shocked me how similar the issues were and how much like whether I'm in, 100-person company, 1,000-person, 10,000, 100,000 person company, in like a major government agency. Like I've done work in the intelligence agencies and defense context, and like all these like really, when you go through the like security like cordon at MI6, and like it's freaky, and there's guys with guns, like everything about it is very strange. But when you finally get to the actual conference room where the actual work is being done, it's just like, oh yeah. It's just the same old conference room with the same old meetings about the same old organizational issues that everybody has. There's nothing. The only thing that's weird about it is you're like, now what is this product used for again? Like, then it gets strange again. So I'm just like, I don't necessarily need to know. But so I think the essential issue is that startups are like the fruit flies of the business world. We're just through trial and error, and through the fact that we have such a short lifespan, and we do so many more of them, especially the places in Silicon Valley, like we were able to kind of stumble our way into a set of practices that work okay. And we have like a governance paradigm, a management system for managing innovation that we didn't really, wasn't designed to intentionally. We kind of figured it out through trial and error. And you're right, the reason we can do that is because when startups begin, they have nothing to lose. And so liability containment is automatic. Whereas in corporate settings, we have to intentionally create those liability containers to allow experimentation to thrive. And most organizational systems were designed from a different era where that was not the dominant problem. And what's interesting to me, actually, is when I talk about innovation at scale, sometimes I'm talking about big legacy companies that are doing transformations, and I've worked on those. But oftentimes I'm talking about startup companies. Like yesterday's startups are tomorrow's big companies. And yet most entrepreneurs, like us, why did we start a company? Like we hated big companies. We're like, we don't want to go work at a big company. We're going to do a startup. But what I've learned in the years since is that you meet an entrepreneur, you say, well, if you hate big companies so much, why are you trying to start a new one? Like, because all of a sudden you get past product market fit. Now you have 1,000 employees. Now you have 5,000 employees. And it's like, oh my God, you've become the very thing that you hated. And they don't really understand why. It's always a mystery. And I always start with, okay, well, anyone have an org chart? Anyone have an org chart? Can I see the org chart, please? I'm like, okay, if I reanimated the ghost of Alfred Sloan, who invented this system in the 1920s for General Motors, and I brought him back to life, and I showed him your org chart, he'd be like, oh yeah, you're still using that? That's amazing. It lasted 100 years. I'm sure he would be thrilled. But has anything changed in the intervening century that maybe like a little evolution in the structure of the corporation itself is needed? So I kind of think of our project, it's not really about companies versus big companies or startups versus. To me, it's just about birthing a new organizational form, one that has adaptability and kind of 21st century elements right in the DNA, so that it can natively handle these kind of challenges.
Do you find any difference between the ability of the grown-up startups and legacy companies to adapt, or really no? The grown-up startups have grown their way into the same set of problems.
It's not exactly the same, but it's shockingly similar, to the point where like I'll have that exact same meeting with two different companies on the same day, and I'm like disoriented. If like the furniture wasn't really different, I wouldn't know which one I'm in. The reason is that they have offsetting advantages. The upstarts who are now kind of starting to ossify, they have the real true advantage that there's at least some people around who founded the company and who remember, they have like been through the experience of building it from scratch once, and if you can get them to kind of tap into that understanding, you can say, look, you were once the founder and you were once the source of good ideas, but now you manage founders. So you have to help them learn what you did originally. Like having that is really extremely helpful. In a lot of companies I work with, the founders are long dead. So, the ghost of Thomas Edison is not going to come back and help GE. So that's like a huge issue. But the flip side is companies like GE that have been through a lot of management transformations over the years, they have a tremendous apparatus for transformation itself. Think about the learning and development and training and orientation. Like all of those skills and tools are incredibly valuable if you can repurpose them for this. And startups tend not to have any of that stuff and have to build all that from scratch. So I think that's kind of the offsetting advantage. You wrote a lot about the time at GE, and you consulted there. And what went right there? And also, given some of the recent news, what went wrong there? I mean, I'm now 3 administrations of GE out of date, so I don't really understand what's going on there now. I was there during the era when there was this incredible mismatch between what was happening at the board level and what was happening on the ground. And I didn't, of course, now in my mind's eye, it has tragic music playing behind it, but at the time I didn't know what was going on. No, I was not at that level, so I did not know. So at the same time that we were trying to, and successfully, I think, transforming all these teams and divisions and parts of the organization to work in this more customer-centric way, the board was trying to artificially engineer growth through all this synthetic stuff. And I mean, just like, don't they wish they had the whatever $20 billion a year in buybacks they were spending at the top? I mean, just like they were doing the stuff that was about artificially inflating the stock price and about trying to kind of get out from under these investor expectations that were not, as I understand, not realistic. And of course, that's a recurring theme in my work, is you wind up with this misalignment between no matter how good your management structure is, if the incentives that drive people are misaligned with that, you're in real trouble. And and it's very pernicious. You don't really understand it in the moment. It took me, I only kind of see it in retrospect now, the quarterly focus, and it's just the absolute focus on short-term stock price performance as the key metric. I mean, just really horrendous. And that's just an incredible amount. And to me, the value that was destroyed and that's bad. But the impact that it has on the hundreds of thousands of people that work there is what I always go back to. It's just really tragic to watch people trying to do the right thing in the face of these bad incentives, and having their work on the ground level be undermined by these people in boardrooms miles away.
Well, you've spent some time on the issue, so people may not know, but you run, among other things, you run a stock exchange now.
Yeah, America's newest stock exchange.
America's newest stock exchange, which is SEC licensed and registered.
Yes,
congratulations.
Just a little while ago. Thank you very much.
Tell us about the LongTerm Stock Exchange.
Sure, it's called the LongTerm Stock Exchange, LTSE, and it has been it started out as just kind of a passion project of mine. I know it's a strange thing to have a passion for a regulated financial services company. But if you dig out your old copy of Lean Startup, those that have it, and you turn to the very last page, this is an idea that I floated that somebody else should really do. That's the best part about being an author, by the way. You get to just write stuff. They're somebody should really do blah, 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 whatever you want. And it's unregulated. You could just write whatever you want. Yeah. And because Lean Startup was a success, a lot of people took a lot of the ideas that were in that book and ran with them. And it's had all these interesting impacts, and it's been great. But I had suggested that our goal as a movement, I think of this as a movement for change, birthing this new organizational form, figuring out new ways for human organizations to support human beings in a better way. People in that movement need to be thinking about the whole ecosystem and not just our little narrow product development or finance or IT or whatever our narrow job is. We have a whole ecosystem that is a real mess. And so back then I was we need to figure out some way to create better alignment between long-term oriented investors and long-term oriented companies. And so that should be a stock exchange, the LongTerm Stock Exchange, to embody a new social contract between investors and managers. And that was 2011 that book came out.
Because stock exchanges actually have abilities to influence the rules of the.
Yeah,
they're quasi-regulators.
They are literally regulators. Yeah. Stock exchanges have a delegated grant of sovereign power from the United States federal government to regulate the behavior of investors and managers. So now that we have that grant, we take it very seriously. But the way that stock exchanges and the broader financial system historically have been run is through transaction fees. So trading volume drives the financial system. And so from the point of view of a company, how is that helpful? If your company is destroyed by the financial system, but it generates a lot of trading volume on the way down, a lot of people who are supposed to be regulating you profit from that. And then people are why do the rules always change in such a way to drive more transaction volume and not these other effects that we want? It's it's no great mystery. The people who are in the room where it happens all get paid from one thing, and so it's very stressful. So our idea is just, let's take that regulatory power and embody a different set of rules. So we are the first new differentiated approach to corporate governance in the exchange world since the creation of NASDAQ.
And do you see that 60s. Fixation on, and we talk a lot, being a private company, that is an advantage, but and that sort of the vicissitudes of the public markets.
Yeah.
But do you see overcoming that quarterly treadmill of meeting market expectations as the biggest thing that the exchange can do?
Yeah, I mean, just it's almost too big to imagine that we could honestly accomplish it, right? It's such a governing force in our world, and just think about how many of the problems we have in sustainability or inequality, or you pick your favorite problem and you can trace its root cause to that. And so it's not only about the quarterly treadmill, like that, that is monumental. And we think a lot, our rules are about redesigning the experience of being a manager in a public company. Like ultimately where this matters is not in the boardroom or wherever, but like thousands and thousands of individual people make decisions every day that they think are what they're supposed to do. And that's where the corruption seeps in. So if we can change that decision making just a little bit to be more sustainable, more long-term, but also more multi-stakeholder. So we're having like a massive debate in our society about like what is the purpose of a corporation? Why does it exist? Why do we have them? What are its obligations to the constituent elements that it interacts with? Its its employees, its shareholders, its community, its vendors and suppliers. And this is an old Deming idea from the early days of the lean revolution. Going back to Toyota Production System, stuff like that. That like a corporation that squeezes its own suppliers is self-defeating. Right, because you can't get quality that way. You can only get low cost that way, and that's ultimately self-defeating. And if you squeeze your employees, right, think about Toyota Production System and respect for people and that whole philosophy. And like the unsustainable way that we operate business is just like self-evidently destroying. We're all going to be dead. So what could the shareholder value do if we're all dead? So like it has this kind of like basic errors I think that have kind of seeped into corporate thinking. That are reversible. Like they're actually relatively recent in the philosophy of business, and therefore reversible.
Were you surprised that the Business Roundtable even turned around on this recently? Did you see this?
Yeah, I certainly saw
it. This just by way of background, the Business Roundtable, which was sort of widely considered the the business lobby, recently issued a statement talking about the purpose of a corporation is multi-stakeholder, not shareholder-centric.
Yeah, it's like we're finally starting to see the Milton Friedman paradigm of what a corporation is start to be unwound, and I was on the one hand I was surprised. I'm every time there's something like that happens, for us it's just great news. It's fantastic. Like when I was first talking about this 5 or 10 years ago, people thought it was really out there. And now I'm like, but look, all these fancy CEOs are doing it. But on the other hand, with a lot of these pledges and groups and stuff, there's also this question of well, so what? What are they going to do? Okay, they signed this pledge, but then what are they going to do? Some people say that they're all excited about that because anything that reduces shareholder primacy reduces their own accountability. And so the alternative to shareholder primacy is that directors and CEOs are accountable only to themselves. And I can see how you get 181 CEOs to sign on to that. That wouldn't be too hard at all. So I think we're at this moment where we as a elite, broadly speaking, of people who kind of lead our society, have to start to get serious about these things. We have not done a good job. This has not been the last few decades of. We have not been crowned in glory in governance and responsibility to posterity. Without being too specific, you all understand what I'm talking about.
How do you create a safety valve? I mean, short-termism may be now well understood.
Yeah.
How do you create a safety valve on what you might call long-termism, right? So Silicon Valley sometimes gets criticized for, empowering, putting so much power in the hands of a single individual that they are in some way protected from any feedback.
That's also ridiculous. I know. This is we've gotten into a really bad situation where we've polarized governance into two extreme camps that are both ridiculous. So the idea that anyone who wants should be able to borrow money at any time and get extra votes to get companies to do whatever they want, that is self-evidently ridiculous. But unlimited power monarchies, with despotic rulers, that has not had a great historical track record either. And all I think was just let's bring a little bit of political philosophy to bear on this problem, just the tiniest bit. We all, last time I checked, live in a constitutional republic. And so we actually have a very good intuitive understanding of how this problem is normally solved in a political context, which is people we don't, the idea that you could run a country of this size, through direct referendum, on every issue. Imagine by proxy contests to where citizens would contract with ISS to find out who to vote for. And then it just, how can that possibly work? That doesn't make sense. And obviously if someone is a tourist to this country, they don't get to vote on election day, go back home and their vote counts because they don't live that's not unfair to the tourists. It's just citizens and tourists are two different categories of people, and that's perfectly fine. And that doesn't mean that we should treat either of them disrespectfully, but just the rules should be different. And yet, if you take that that idea is hard to defend on the merits. And then is the idea that Facebook's governance control will pass to Mark Zuckerberg's daughter. Like, think about I guess Succession is now a TV show. Like what are we gonna do? Like, what's the plan? Like, so I get that it's fine for now, but like, what eventually is our plan? So then people are like, well, then we're gonna have like an arbitrary sunset on it. But then you're like, okay, like, can anyone think of some problems that could happen if like, right on the like, now people have like an incentive like on the day before, the day after the sunset, like just all this stuff, and then. If it was a good idea that the CEO of this company should have all this power to be able to realize a vision, wouldn't the logic of that still apply to the next CEO? So like it's just like these ideas are not intellectually rigorous, I don't think. And so we've tried to push an alternate governance model through LTSE where the founders and the insiders who have power should share co-determination with the long-term investors, but not the tourists. Which I would not have thought would be a controversial idea, but oh my God, are people obsessed with voting rules for corporations, like a very, very polarized world of ideological people. So anyway, so we've tried to go peacefully in that rule, and again, not to like, unless people want to know more, I can talk about it, but the way we've designed the rules of the LTSE, we're the only exchange where our rules are principles-based rather than rules-based, like just checkbox-based. So we create broad principles that companies have to comply with. Companies then build implementation plans in accordance with those principles. We certify that the plan really does meet the principles, so it can't just be a fake, whitewash. And then once the plan is adopted, it becomes binding on the corporation, like listing standards on the penalty of committing securities fraud if you deviate from the plan. So we can give these stakeholder ideas and all these highfalutin stuff like real teeth, real operational impact.
Yeah, because you're effectively a regulator. Has this,
Yeah.
I can see all the people who would be opposed to this for a whole variety of different reasons.
Yeah.
Have you garnered support from places that you didn't expect it to come from?
Yes, I mean, I didn't think anyone would support it. Like the first,
so everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody who's supporting.
Every supporter we have is a miracle. Honestly, the first, like, probably 1,000 conversations I had about this, you can imagine the number of people I talked to before I decided to start this company for real, were, like, very negative. I mean, people, and especially people out here. I mean, in San Francisco, like, this is considered, like, quixotic and strange, but not actively harmful. So people would just be like, that will never work, or that's stupid. That's fine. But out here, the first, like, hundreds of conversations, people would be like, this is evil. This is un-American. You're violating the efficient market hypothesis. Man, there's just like a crazy, like, people have really very visceral reactions to it. And what people don't realize is like that kept me going. Because that's how people talked about lean startup in the early days. People cannot comprehend this now. But like the first, I don't know how many companies I tried to advise on lean startup, but it was very polarizing. People would yell at me. I was ejected from many conference rooms for like spreading heretical bad ideas that were never gonna work. Like it was very, very polarizing. So like, to me, that was really interesting. But yeah, now we have like all these pension funds and sovereign funds and family offices who've come rallied to our cause. Even one of our greatest critics wrote a favorable comment letter for us on our most recent SEC filing out of the blue, which we were very.
Who was that?
That's the Council of Institutional Investors, who are one of the like ideologues in the voting wars, who had like previously criticized our approach, and they had even criticized one of our filings that didn't say anything about voting on the possibility that we might do something about voting in the future. So it was like we are preemptively opposed to something that they might do in the future. So I was not expecting when we did this multi-stakeholder filing for them to be like, well, in spite of ourselves, we actually think this is pretty good. So like it's also a strange world where like enemies become allies, and it's a dynamic, very dynamic world.
What was it like having kind of written this script for startups, right? To finally jump back in yourself.
Terrible.
and be a founder again.
Yeah, well, it's such a lifestyle downgrade. First of all, I mean, running companies is no fun. And there's something about, I'm glad I did it now. It's easy for me to be like, it was like good for me. But in the early days of it, I remember being like, what have I done? Like, because first of all, people's expectations were very high that I should like know what I'm doing. And I'd never done startup where like people had expectations before. I was always like the underdog where nobody cared, and now I was like, oh, well, I guess, this better work. But I reassured myself that like, luckily I've picked something so crazy that everyone thinks it's gonna fail. That like, if it does fail, it won't be my fault. It was inherently too crazy to work, so that was okay. And then the other thing was, it's one thing to write about these ideas, but in your mind's eye, in your memory, they become nostalgic. So I've been writing about how hard it is to be an entrepreneur and the pain and the difficulty of like going through a pivot or whatever. But I think I had almost like made it into like a mental, it was like my mental Disneyland. Like I look on fondly with the fights that we used to have about the startup when it was in its death throes, and like those are good times in my memory. But of course, when you actually live through it, like we went through
it took 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Now so like to be back in the midst of it, that was actually it's very bracing. But I think it's healthy. I feel like if you just become someone who just talks about something all the time, like you eventually you lose all your credibility. So that's actually been helpful for me to be back in it.
So, thinking back over that retrospective 20 years, you've seen, when we started, basically it was the beginning of the internet. I think, most of the phrases I know about technology, I may have first heard from you, like open source. But there was a sense that technology was this, force for good, that innovation was, something which, was sort of unquestioned, that something we wanted, we just didn't have enough of.
Yeah, right, just need more.
And I think you interviewed early days, you mentioned, Facebook, you interviewed early days there, and
sure.
talk about breaking things. And now we step back, move fast, break things. Now we step back and kind of like, are we breaking the right things? Are there things that maybe tech is breaking that we shouldn't be breaking?
Look around, yeah. It's been a bad few years for tech. Well, so zooming way out, I'm still very optimistic because like, as dark as things seem at the moment, like if you look at the like long run trends for just like health outcomes or literacy, mortality, global inequality, like there's like tremendous good news that we who are inside it and who read the news every day like wouldn't don't see. And I think innovation is like a big part of that story. So I'm still very like personally optimistic about it. But I think the idea that we can tech has become so powerful, and the leverage that you get from technology, like the idea that we can kind of like do those experiments, kind of this like amoral, ahistorical, like we'll just see what happens. I'm sure it'll be fine. Like where I think that I'm glad that that's been discredited. I'm hoping that will lead to a lot more introspection about what founders do, and technology just basically has to grow up. Like we just become more mature as we come to grapple with the effects. But even still, and I'm not an especially idealistic person. Like I don't expect a lot from organizations and corporations, having seen the insides of how they operate. Like most of them are very badly run. Even still, even I was shocked at the degree of irresponsibility of like what Facebook did in recent years. Just like even knowing the people involved and like understand. Even still, I couldn't believe the actions that they took. So it's still a bit of a mystery to me because I can't imagine putting myself into those situations. But I think a lot of it has to do with just like surrounding yourself with people who will tell you the truth or not. Building governance and system and management systems that help you evaluate the effects that the products that you make have on people. Like, can you imagine if forget the political stuff for a second, that's disgraceful, but go back to when Facebook first commissioned, they did a really rigorous academic study on the effect of Facebook on mood and discovered that like there's a dose response result for Facebook. The more you use it, the more depressed you are. So like, can you imagine if when they had found that out, they had like there was somebody's job in the company to care, and like anybody, like somebody who had a fiduciary obligation to make sure that was taken serious. Like I think the world would be so different today. But it's like the tobacco companies all over again. They knew and they didn't care. They're very disappointing.
Do you have? We're sort of at the beginning of artificial intelligence, and we talk a lot about that in the future of work. It comes up a lot in our conversations. But it's not as impactful as Google and Facebook now. Maybe it will be very soon.
Yeah.
Do you have similar concerns about the beginnings of artificial intelligence and how that's going to get used?
Yeah, it's already being used. I think people are too worried about the singularity and like the Terminator movie franchise, and not nearly worried.
Are computers going to gain consciousness? You answered this once.
Yeah, obviously, but
in our lifetime.
Well, listen, pretty clearly to me, pretty soon. But like that's actually not. I'm not all worried about that because we are already putting these tools in the hands of humans who already have consciousness,
right.
And we're doing horrible things with them, and like we're empowering authoritarian regimes, and like we're using it for police surveillance, and like just like really bad stuff. So like we don't need machine intelligence to do bad stuff. We have perfectly malign human intelligence using those tools right now. So I think we're kind of like we have to get serious about this. Like if you think about like the major civic institutions that govern our lives, like what do the following institutions have in common, right? Hotels, schools, universities, political parties, newspapers, like stock exchanges, public companies. Like, what do these institutions all have in common? Like, I would say that all of them unexpectedly and recently have like lost their reason to exist. They've basically collapsed. We don't need them anymore in the way that we needed them before. Like hotels is the easiest because like we just look at hotels. It used to be that we had to have hotels in order to solve a very important social problem of like where people stay when they travel. And then all of a sudden, like practically overnight, we don't need them anymore. We can solve that problem completely fine without them. And if every hotel in the entire world instantly disappeared tomorrow, like it would no longer be a catastrophe. Whereas like 10 years ago, it would have been really a big deal. Like I don't think we've really processed what that means. That's like really quite remarkable. But the thing is, the hotels are still there. They didn't disappear just because their economic logic went away. And if you look at the like healthcare entrepreneurs who are trying to replace hospitals. One of my favorite entrepreneurs told me the story that he's like, if aliens were to analyze our society from a distance, they would assume that hospitals are places that you get incarcerated to if you've committed a grave crime, because they're places of illness. Like you're much like it'd be a punishment that you'd be sent to a hospital. I think that's a place of healing is ridiculous. But like, it used to be that the logic, the economic logic of needing to aggregate expertise and equipment, through gatekeeper access to, like we had to have hospitals to do that work, but now we don't need that anymore. And I won't even get into political parties, but like we don't have them anymore. We don't need them, except in every one of these examples, like when we replace political parties with whatever we have now, when we replace newspapers with Facebook, when we replace hotels with Airbnb, in each of those cases, some of the civic virtues of the old model evaporated, because they weren't essential to it. We didn't realize how valuable it was. Like, so having newspapers provide a shared sense of the truth that we all had, it wasn't designed into the creation of the newspapers. It was a side effect of the particular production technology that made newspapers work. So when we created Facebook, we didn't intentionally design that into Facebook. We just assumed that it would take care of itself. And I think the kind of challenge before us is every one of these institutions is going to have to be reinvented and built in a 21st century way. But if we don't actively, consciously, deliberately put those virtues in and make them part of the design parameters, then we're going to wind up with a whole society run by Facebook. That's not going to be too good.
So one last question, then I want to open it up to the audience because we've covered a lot of ground. But I think the hardest thing, maybe it's hard for the people at Facebook, and it's certainly hard when you think about innovation in business, is the hardest thing to do in life and business is sort of to break these habits, right? That totally. You have these conversations and they make a lot of sense, and you kind of nod, we should innovate, we should move faster, we should do these things, and then you go back to your desk and you've got emails to return, phone calls to return, things to deal with.
Yeah.
And so if there were kind of one thing, I won't call it a hack, but one thing you found in your travels that has been, that is a habit of, good entrepreneurs and good leaders, and not just at the high, but at every level of an organization, to kind of break that mold. What is it? What should we incorporate into our days, our weeks, our months to kind of break that?
Yeah. It's actually a deep question, because the question is like, what causes what, right? So like, if you make one change, that will cascade to more changes. So I'll answer with a story. I was working with a corporate executive, long time, very senior person, and he was in one of his teams had come to a lean startup workshop, and he wasn't that thrilled about it, but through a long series of circumstances, he was assigned to go with them. So they were excited to be there, but he was not at all excited to be there. But he did it anyway because some senior person, even more senior person than him, had made him do it. And as we went through the workshop, as he was learning lean startup, he started to get kind of interested in it. And he was like, okay, well, I'm willing to have this one team in my portfolio. Like one team can try this a different way, and we'll see what happens. And he did a weekly meeting with them, and they had their pivot or persevere meetings. They really kind of did it lean startup by the book, and he was getting kind of excited about it. And one of the things that we had taught in that workshop was that when he was doing his reviews with this team, he had to get out of the old stage gate mentality of go kill, but rather pivot or persevere, right? Is the strategy that the team is executing, is that taking us closer to the vision or not? And so should we have a change in strategy without a change in vision? And so the questions we asked him to ask every time were, instead of like, are you doing a good job? Are you on track? We would train him to ask, what did you learn and how do you know? Those are the two questions for every review. What did you learn? How did you know? And the first like 50 times, the team didn't believe him and they did the stand-up. But eventually they started to get trust with him that he was serious about what they learned. And he, of course, through that process, what they would discover is that ideas that they themselves and the executive too, a week ago thought were brilliant, when the customer laughed them out of the room, your brain automatically retroactively decides that you knew all along that that wasn't a bad idea. And so like then the people who are telling you this information are stupid. So like this like helps you counteract that cognitive bias. So then he told me this story that I thought was wonderful. He was having this review with them. He went it over, asked them those questions, and he hung up the phone. And like any good executive, he went to his calendar, and it's just call all day long, having calls with people. So he just gets on his next phone call, and it's the regional sales manager from, I think it was like Barcelona, calling to report quarterly sales numbers for this new product that they've just introduced to the market, this European market. And he's calling with bad news. Sorry, boss, we've missed our numbers. And the guy's like, well, I knew what to do. My years of training kicked in, and I was about to take his head off. Like how, you know, he's like gearing up to give him the whole speech about your, you know, how dare you miss the numbers a quarter or so. And he was like, it just like popped in his head. He's like, what if I tried something different here, just for fun? So he's like, well, what did you learn? And he said there was a full 1 minute of silence on the phone. Because the guy's like gearing up to, everyone knows what's coming. And he's like, well, boss, turns out that this market is really different from the home market. This is like American companies always learn this, like shocking, like it's different. It's like,
you don't know anything about that.
You won't believe it, but things here are not the same as in America, and the people here don't, well, I can't remember, I've heard so many stories over the years, like sometimes it's like there's an indigenous competitor that we didn't know about and their product is better for this market, or like it's cheaper, or our thing is 3 orders of magnitude too expensive for this market, or for whatever reason, like the playbook that we normally use to go to market is like catastrophically misaligned with this market. So like no matter how hard we had worked, nothing could possibly have worked. It was doomed from the start. And then he was like, well, how do you know? And you know, if the guy had been BSing him, he would have sniffed it out. But he's like, I got reams of data for you. Like, this is what customer. And he like learned this amazing thing. And he's like, oh my God, like he like had this breakthrough moment with this regional sales manager who was still like in shock that he wasn't getting yelled at. And they made a new plan. And he was like, and then he was like, what if I did it in my next meeting? What if I did it again? And he was like, how many of the meetings do I have? Are people not telling me this information that I desperately, like while I'm busy yelling at them, are they secretly thinking to themselves, like, what a moron? He didn't ask me the one question that would have given him this critical information. It just like really transformed his whole approach. So like that's a really easy one to just like change the way that you review. You don't have to do it for every meeting, but like just try every once in a while to and then if you start to do that, that will then lead you to, well, was this a well-defined experiment in the first place? Like, we spent 18 months launching this product to run this experiment, but like, since 100% of customers thought this was dumb, but logically speaking, the first 10 customers we pulled off the street also would have thought it was dumb. So they can like lead you down a path to good stuff. And then the other thing is that if at any moment, including now or any other time, you find yourself to be inspired to try one of these new things, the critical thing, inspiration is such a perishable resource. You have to lock in some kind of accountability to actually do it. So like, if you came here with somebody that you know and you are feeling like you want to do it, you got to be like, will you please call me 1 week from today and ask me about all the experiments I did in the week, and then make me report to you about it. That's like people, because like the week will be gone before you know it. It'll be the emails and everything. Like it'll be next week before you know it, and you won't have done anything. And like a lot of people in corporate settings are trained to kind of like, okay, think about something and then let's have the meeting to make the plan, to schedule the meeting, to figure out the stakeholders, to who should be in the meeting for the decision, to whatever. Next thing you know, it's 18 months later and it's too late. This has got to be the kind of thing where you got to actually like do the experiments on a rapid enough clip that you can learn from it. So like force yourself to run a complete build, measure, learn feedback loop like between now and a week from today, and you'll be transformed, I guarantee it.
That's terrific. So let's open it up to questions from the audience as well. Anybody?
Hey, Eric. So as an entrepreneur and an author yourself, is there a particular author or entrepreneur that inspired you in your career and your ultimate trajectory?
Ooh, that's really good. So there's actually two halves to that. In my actual like career as an entrepreneur, I drew a lot of inspiration from like mentors of mine and people that like helped me, like famous people know Steve Blank and people like Kent Beck. Like I had the kind of the advantage of really amazing mentors who I was able to learn from their mistakes and grow from them. And then as I started to become an author and started to like understand what was going on, I got to like retcon all my ideas into all these like great management thinkers. So then I became like really the student of like Taiichi Ohno, for those who know Toyota Production System and the history of Toyota, Deming, what I was talking about before, people who had faced kind of historical moments like this and come up with ideas. And in the early days of it, what I kept expecting to happen is that I would eventually find that one book or that one thinker that would answer all my questions. And what would happen is, like, if you read there's like a great book called Lean Thinking, one of the original lean manufacturing books. If you haven't read it, highly recommend. And there's a chapter in there where it talks about when you do a lean manufacturing transformation in a conventional mass production factory, you'll probably be able to produce twice the output with half the physical space and half the staff. So you have to promise everybody at the outset, we're not going to lay anybody off as a result of doing this transformation. Otherwise, you can't enlist people in a transformation that will undermine their own job. Like that's never going to work. So you break this promise, and it's like, therefore, it's really important to, as soon as you get this extra capacity, you immediately create new products to fill the capacity of the factory to keep it full again. And I was like, now we're going to get to the one topic I'm actually interested in this topic, which is how do you know what the new product should be to keep the factory full? And I'm like, turn the page, and it's like end of chapter, on to a new topic. And I'm like, well, and if you read all these classic books, they all have this problem where like it's just considered obvious that like if you run a ball bearing factory, like to create new products means to make new kinds of ball bearings. It's very, like that demand, like supply will create its own demand, and it's like that linkage has got broken. But apart from that like recurring issue, a lot of those people were like that. Those are the ones that really helped me kind of put all the pieces together.
Awesome, thank you.
Who's got the mic?
Hi, I just had a question regarding, so you think about these executives or organizations that you had the opportunity to work with and sort of implement maybe a new way of thinking or something along that line. Where does that line start from, or where do you draw the line, I guess, from sort of a forced program or something like that to something that's maybe more organic that could sort of course through the organization naturally?
It's actually a really good question, and it's easy to get it wrong. Like I've gotten it wrong many times, where you either go too grassroots and you never kind of get to critical mass, or you're too top down, too top heavy, and you kind of force it. There's this interesting interplay where it's kind of like you go top down, and then it's like you alternate. So, for example, generally speaking, in a corporate context, you can't begin a transformation unless there's some grassroots experimentation going on. So that's already happening. Sometimes that's already happening by the time I get involved, and that's great. But oftentimes, in order for that even experiment to begin, you need an executive to give permission. So like an executive will be like, yes, okay, I'll authorize a pilot program or a pilot project or anything. I'm generally like, we'll take any initial pilot if people will try it. But then you do a bunch of things, you get to a critical mass, and then like, what's the purpose of that experimentation? There's only so far you can grow a grass. People have tried to go all grassroots with these things. They always fizzle out because transformation is like, it's very Game of Thrones. Like you win or you die. It's like the transformation either makes it to complete corporate, full company adoption, or the backlash overwhelms it and it's eradicated. So if you go too long just in the grassroots level, it's not effective. So the way I conceive it, and I try to make this framework more formal in the startup way, is that in the first phase of the transformation, you're doing grassroots work to get to critical mass for the purpose of convincing senior management that this is something they can double down on. And then in the next phase of the transformation, you're using the tools of like the corporate discipline and hierarchy to drive awareness of the opportunity to work in this new way across the whole organization. So there's kind of an interesting interplay between them, but it's very delicate, and you have to get it right. It's quite challenging.
Jim had a question. All right.
Yeah, Eric, just real quickly, maybe not so quickly. When you look at trying to get the organization to move towards change, right, for a transformation,
Yeah.
at what point do you stop and you say, when does the incentives make the biggest difference for the big transition to take place? Meaning to get it deep in the organization, or is it something other than an incentive?
Yeah, that's a really big question. That's very difficult to answer quickly. I'll do my best. So there's a couple pieces to this. The first is incentives really matter, but incentives are not just financial. So the first thing is, I was talking about the phases of transformation, there are what I call the deep systems of the corporation, like the true like third rail stuff, like at GE, when we finally changed their legendary employee management system, EMS, we studied like HR in college. Like when I first got there, like it was the very first things I encountered. I was like, well, this is obviously going to have to change. This is totally incompatible with what you want to do. And they were like, you can't change. It was like I was like saying you got to change gravity. And they're like, you don't understand. This is not changeable. It's just the way things are. But they eventually made dramatic changes to it. But when the political will to do so was there. So I really believe in like the critical incentive design pieces are, first of all, obviously how people get paid. So bonus structures, but much more importantly than that, who gets the prerogative to work on what? How are resources allocated to teams? How are people promoted? And how do people get assigned to projects? Like those systems are very, very, very influential. And if you don't change that stuff, eventually, transformation can't stick.
Does organization then change? Does the organizational structure change
Yes.
before incentive? Or
You have
incentives
to,
for
yes,
organization change?
I think we have to build a new org chart because today in most corporations, entrepreneurship is not a recognized function. So people who are good at it can't be promoted. And that sounds simple, but it's actually like a major career path issue. And so it requires entrepreneurial type activities to be done underground, off book. That makes entrepreneurship the enemy of finance, compliance, and audit. And those people are too strong. You don't fight those guys and win. So, but with all that said, there's also really good research that incentive design, financial incentives distort behavior as much as align behavior. Anyone's looked at that research, it's a mess. So you just paying people to do a good job at whatever can lead them gaming the system that creates the reward. So the research that I believe in says that what matters for incentive design is people have the psychological sensation of having a stake in the outcome. They believe that the work they do matters and they'll have control and agency over it. Now in Silicon Valley, we accomplish that directly, crudely through equity ownership in the thing itself. That's awfully convenient way to do it. But there are alternative ways. I've seen it work like in nonprofits and NGOs where that would be impossible. And I've also seen companies adopt like synthetic equity-ish type structures for people. But a lot of cases, it's really just believing that like if you do a good job, you will actually get the credit for it. And your manager won't just swoop in at the last minute and take the credit from you, which is like a problem in a lot of companies. Thank you. That's a good question.
Thank you very much for your time. Really interesting. One thing, I think a couple days ago you spoke about agility in Germany. Is that correct?
That's true.
But he didn't have any voice.
My voice is a lot better now. I was dying on stage. I was in Frankfurt. Yeah.
And maybe this is more comment. This sounds a lot like agility. The principles you're talking about and the best practices. So maybe shed some light on that more. Just are they kind of dovetailed together?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the corporate, I like to imagine the corporation, imagine you had a true God's eye view of the modern corporation. And you could look at each of the organizational silos. And imagine, visualize, you could see them as a big grain silo, each silo one after the other. And here you have business, marketing, engineering, operations, manufacturing, operations, IT, design. So imagine you could actually pop the top off like a big Pringles can, you pop off and you peer inside and you're like, wow, inside of each of these silos, someone is running a really iterative, customer-centric, scientific development process of some kind. This is really cool. Each discipline has developed its own. We have design thinking, we have agile, we have DevOps, we have lean manufacturing, we have customer development, we have, there's so many theories. And yet, then you'd be like, well, I guess this corporation as a whole must make really customer-centric, highly iterative, scientific design decisions. But then you zoom out again, and you're like, but wait a minute, how does work product flow from silo to silo? Oh, no. It's just a straight line. From here, the design thinking people build a requirements document. And they hand this 300-page binder off to the implementation people who then highly iteratively discover all the things that were wrong with it. But there's no feedback loop to go back the other way. They're just, right? Yeah, have you lived through that in your friend's company? You've seen And of course, and if you were the CEO of such a company, you'll be shocked to discover that like practically every day, one of the leaders of one of those silos comes in and says, boss, I got a great idea. If you just put my function in charge of the other functions and make them do my thing, that will solve the problem. So like people write all this stuff about the agile corporation, the design thinking people want design corporation, the lean manufacturing, everyone's like being corporation. And of course, like if you could actually do that, and everyone's correct. But like, how would you ever overcome the internecine battle that would be required, right? You know what I'm talking about? So I think that, like, and when I give a talk to like a group of designers, sometimes I'll get the question in the audience, isn't this just design thinking but repackaged for the engineers? And I always give them the same answer, I'm always like, oh yeah. But do me a favor. Don't tell the engineers. Think how pissed off they would be if they knew, right? And then the engineers are like, isn't this just agile rebranded for the business people? It is. But don't tell them. I think how pissed off they would be if they heard, right? Like, because we have to get out of this like tribal mentality and level up to the question of like, what is the unit of progress for the whole corporation? So like if you read the Agile Manifesto, which I'm a huge fan, I was like a major extreme programming zealot in the day, and Kent Beck is the mentor, and like, you know, I'm very serious about this stuff. But if you read the Agile Manifesto, right there in the manifesto, it says that the unit of progress of a software development team is a line of working code. So how are you ever going to get a non-software person ever to care about that as the unit of progress? And like in a high uncertainty situation, it's clearly not the unit of progress. Since if I write a line of working code, but I'm solving the wrong problem, then I've just created waste. So we have to be able to create a language, a lingua franca that can work across the whole organization. It has to be denominated in what, you know, in the startup terms we would call validated learning, which is a way of translating these abstract ideas like learning into dollars and cents. So we have to be able to discuss in financial terms the impact of the work that we're doing. So I view agile, lean manufacturing, customer development, DevOps, like those are foundational, critical, important components of this transformation. And yet they require some translation to be used across the whole company. That's my view.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we can continue the conversation upstairs.
So if you think back to like the start of industrialism, one of the big critiques was sort of the disassociation of the worker from his work product.
Yes.
Do you see, as you see the lean startup methods, agile methods, these kinds of things being ushered into organizations, do you see it as a way to solve that dilemma or critique in a more modern, new way of dealing with corporations in terms of allowing workers and people to be more collaborative, interact with the customer, be part of the solution making, less hierarchical, more empowered, all that stuff. Have you thought anything about that?
Yeah, I like that. That's a really good point. No, I haven't. I mean, I'm thinking about it right now. I do think that's right. I think there was something really essential that was lost in the transition from craft production to mass production. And it had to do with the benefits of scientifically rigorously studying work in scientific management were so, because the organization of work historically had been so badly mismanaged because we hadn't applied any science to it. Like scientific management made like the rewards from doing that were so astronomical, it totally dwarfed the cost of this loss. But as we've gotten better and better and better and better at production, we're now confronting business problems where figuring out how to produce more quantity of things is no longer our problem. So we as a society, we have more productive capability than we know what to do with. We're a society drowning in stuff, and the fact that some people are hungry and go without is strictly a political problem. Like, it's actually a remarkable statement that we have the productive capability to feed and clothe every person that lives if we wanted to. So that, like, our grandparents, you know, like the fathers of scientific management would have found that problem, they would have found that statement like a truly remarkable statement. They would have known what to do with it. For them, management was always about creating more things. So as we've gotten into a world where the dominant question is no longer how do we build more stuff, but what stuff is worth building in the first place, human creativity is now a much more important element of the equation to drive outcomes. Now, the lean manufacturing people would say it always was, and this should never have been lost in the first place, and I'm sure they're right. But regardless, it's certainly the time we live in now, a time when we have to figure out how to harness creativity more universally. And so like, yeah, I like that framing of this as like rather than boldly going into an uncertain new future, we're actually recapturing something that had been lost from the promised land. That's a good one.
And what's ironic about it, I think it's the application of the scientific method to industry, to craft production that led to the alienation of the worker. And what you're talking about is really the reintroduction of some of that scientific thinking about, falsifiable hypotheses,
Yes.
really thinking about like what are we building and how do we draw those experiments and learn from them that might lead us back to, the connection between the work and the work product. I find that ironic.
No, yeah, I mean, you're totally right. And there's a humanism to this that I think is really important not to lose. Like, it's a very, lean startup is a more efficient way of working. We all make more money. We can make more stuff. We can build more successful startups. Like we can have better venture capital firms. We can do better private. That's not always good. That's all good. I mean, no argument with that. It's all good. But there's also a humane issue, which is that we are about to enter an era in which all boring work will be automated. There will be no more boring jobs. And I mean the blue collar jobs. I mean the white collar jobs. Like if you can specify what is to be done in such a way that can be done in a rote way, like human beings will not be doing that work anymore. So what will the people be doing? Because they're still going to be here. Right, we're gonna have, seriously, it is gonna be sales. It's gonna be design. If it can't be automated, it must have some element of creativity to it. And so we're about to run a societal-wide experiment in which jobs actually have creativity in them and which ones didn't, after all. And we're not all gonna be pleased with the results. We're not all gonna be happy with what we find out. But again, we as an elite of this society, we have an obligation to figure out how do we see this as an opportunity to harness this vast untapped resource of all this amazing creativity that today is being wasted on routine and road jobs. If we don't rise to that occasion, pitchforks will be totally earned.
I think that's a good place to leave it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
I can assure you all that Eric was this interesting when he was 18. He just had a bit more experience along the way. Thank you for joining us. We will be going upstairs for drinks and can continue the conversation there. But thank you for coming in tonight.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks, man.